Okay, so I wanted to show you some examples of collagraph plates that students had made in the past and give you an idea of what kind of things are possible. Now, obviously, this design is relatively simple. It is really just one technique that's being used here. You could take an X-Acto knife or a box cutter knife like so, and this is done on a piece of mat board. So this is the colored side. Obviously, this is what the decorative side would look like. The interior of the board was just white. But what the artist did here to make this piece was to take a knife and literally cut into the mat board and peel up one layer. So there's not a huge difference in height, but there is a slight difference between this section here, which is the original surface of the board, and these lower sections here. So this one is just what I would call a cut and peel technique. Really, really simple and basic. Okay, so that's one of your easiest options. If you do this option, you could obviously print this as a relief really easily, and that's what this is. So here you can see that the print has just had black ink rolled across the plate with a brayer, and the black is sticking to the raised up areas, not to the recessed sections. So we get a simple black and white image that looks kind of like a woodcut. This is the reverse of that, and I think you can kind of see them side by side. You can really see what's happening here. In this case, we took the yellow ink, scraped it across, and wiped. So there's a little bit of plate tone clinging to the raised up areas, but the ink has been forced down into those grooves. So these are almost like opposites of one another, right? This is your relief roll. This is your intaglio inking and wiping. My favorite version, though, is this one. And it really allows you to play around with color. So here you can see we took blue ink, scraped and wiped so blue was down in the grooves. And then we took a red ink on a brayer and rolled across, and the red stuck to the raised up section. So you can actually get both colors happening simultaneously with this method. So that's your simple cut and peel method. This one, if I tilt it, maybe a little easier for you to see. This is the right way up now on the screen. It is a simple landscape. These are flowers on long stems with some leaves overhanging them on the top. All of these forms were made from cut and pasted cardstock paper. So paper about the thickness of a postcard or something along those lines, like a note card, if you were writing notes for a speech. Something that thin will work really well. So all of these pieces were cut either by scissors or with an X-Acto knife or another type of knife and pasted into the board. Once you've got the image arranged, whether you're peeling it or you're gluing it down, you do want to seal the surface by painting it with spray paint. That is a really important step because that is going to prevent the ink from absorbing into the plate, and it will allow the ink to release from the plate onto your board. The best practice, though, is to make the plate, once you finish the design, spray paint it, and then let it rest one day before you start printing. If you try to print on the same day that you've just painted it, more than likely your paper will stick to the paint and it'll set you back. You'll have to start all over again. So this plate was inked. In this technique, you can see that we've actually done the scrape and wipe. So the ink is sticking to the edges of those large shapes, but it's wiping off and leaving plate tone on the raised up sections. So this printing of this plate is the intaglio inking style. So the ink is really going down into the grooves and is kind of sticking to the edges of those cut and pasted pieces. This technique is pretty fun. This one has a couple different things happening all at once, and I believe this is the right way around. No, this is the right way up. So with this plate, we have a bunch of texture that's been created here using some glue. You could use modeling paste, you could use acrylic paint, you could use spackling compound, like if you were trying to repair a hole in a drywall section of a wall. But most of what you're seeing here was made with hot glue, these straight lines. Then this piece was inked with a brayer and wiped a little bit, so you can see that the ink is really down in our lower sections. It's not sticking as much to those upper raised areas. So it creates kind of a cool moonscape effect there. This is another technique that is not a really great image, but is kind of a cool thing to play with. It's a little hard to see, I think, in this light, but if I tilt it, you may be able to see if I take my knife that these shapes, those circular forms, are actually recessed down into the board. You can do what we call embossing. You can take a thin but hard material like metal or plastic. You can run it between two pieces of mat board through the printing press, and that will actually emboss those shapes right into the board. So if you do that, you can print it in a number of different ways. This one was one where I just used one of these little plastic deals that has this circular shape. In this case, I just rolled across it with a brayer of a greenish yellow ink. So the ink stuck to the raised up areas, but not the recessed. In this version, same thing, green ink across, so it leaves an open space where the area was recessed by the embossment. You can see that a little more clearly in this version here. In this case, I took the same piece of plastic. This was a holder for a couple of bottles of like barbecue sauce or something. You know, sometimes they'll come attached one to the other with a plastic ring. In this case, I took the ring and embossed it in one direction, and then embossed it a second time in the other opposite direction. Here's that same design though, inked a completely different way. This is inked, scraped, and wiped. So now my ink is down in the grooves, but I'm getting plate tone everywhere else. Same thing is happening here, ink down in the grooves, but plate tone outside of it. And again, with this one, I really did end up preferring this version of it. I took a blue, scraped and wiped so the blue was down in my recessed areas, and rolled a light yellow-green across the top. So this gives me both the relief effect and the intaglio effect simultaneously. This one printed a little cleaner. Pretty straightforward. So you can create these incised areas either by embossing, or you could even draw it by hand with a ballpoint pen. So you could literally go in there and draw or put words or create textures by incising. This is one of my personal favorites. It's a really cool plate. Sea turtle, yeah? And I don't know if you can really see it if I turn it sideways. Not so much. It's much thicker in its relief than the one that I showed you of the flowers. This one has been created by cutting and gluing together pieces of actual mat board. So there is more of a height difference in the relief. These areas out here, that creating some texture around him on the ground, that's just crumpled up pieces of paper towel that we glued in place, spray painted to seal the whole thing. So this image was printed the same way as the other ones. We tried one where we just rolled the ink across with a brayer, and we got that result. It's pretty awesome. I like how this looks. You can see that this one has much more space of white around those raised areas, and that's of course because they're physically higher up. So the paper can't really touch down near them. So if you want shapes with more of a clean white edge around them, you might want to cut and glue together mat board instead of cardstock. We also inked this guy this way. I love how that looks. Because he has really high height difference, that allows a lot of ink to stay in between the grooves. So when we inked across this and wiped it in the intaglio style, it really left a nice pattern inside all of those areas. We then tried it this way, and this is just an experiment, just to see what the results would be. We used the red ink, scraped and wiped, and rolled over with black. And we decided we liked the effect, but not the color version. So this is one that the artist who did this, threw away. That's a pretty darn good print to me. He was not 100% satisfied with it, so he kept making more of them. But this is what we were talking about a little while ago, about the idea that you could make it almost more like a painting. Here is the same plate printed with slightly different inking style. So you can see that we put the yellow down first, scraped and wiped, and then other colors we'll put on top. In this case, there's black ink down first, and then a lighter color on top. So you can create an enormous range of different effects. That's probably, though, what you may think about aiming for. It's a relatively simple thing to do. You're making a collage, really, but then we're going to be able to ink those and print them to paper. This is one that we did as a group last year, just kind of as an experiment. It's a little hard to see probably in this light, but there are sections in here that were done with glue. There's areas that are cut and pasted in fabric, so there's different pieces of fabric in here. There's a couple pieces of sandpaper. There's things that were hand-drawn, and then the things that were embedded into that space. This is the final version of the print we were able to create. So we had everybody make a separate section. We made these abstract faces and printed all of them together. So you have a really wide variety of things that you can achieve with this particular material. Let me take you through some examples of student projects. Now that you've seen the actual plates, let's take a look at the projects themselves. There. So this is a very, very high relief example that a student did 15 years ago. Those are things that we scavenged out of the trash. They're old pieces of machines and different metal pieces. They're way too thick, really, to print through the printing press, but they could be rolled with a brayer, and then the paper could be burnished by hand, more like what we did with the woodcut or the lino. So that is possible here as well. You can see in this example that he used hand coloring in some areas to create this red effect. And we actually had two different boards. We used this to create the feeling of there being like a fence around the outside of those shapes. This is one of my personal favorites. It is a combination, actually, of a collagraph on one side with a lino cut on the other, and then we printed this pattern on top of that one to create a more interesting effect. But you can see that what's been glued in here are really simple household items. Those are nuts, like from a bolt and nut set. So they're sort of hexagonal shapes around the outside. These were made from small nails. This little shapes inside the leaves. So there's the final version together. Created a really interesting thing with a color combination. These were made primarily from cut pieces of wood. We found, for some reason, I don't know why there were so many of them, but we found a box that had some little balsa wood pieces in the shapes of X's and plus signs. We used those to make these floral shapes. This buffalo is made entirely out of sandpaper to give him the texture of his different fur. We also have some bent wire to make these shapes around the outside, and you can see here some screw eyes like you would use to put into the back of a frame to put a hanging wire. This one has a lot of different materials, mostly fabric and cardboard. You can see here that horizontal striped area. You know how cardboard, if it's corrugated, if you peel one layer back, it has that kind of accordion fold on the inside. So we used that, this piece. This is one of my personal favorites just from a point of view of making something cool. We cut the mat board into the shape of the fish, covered it in glue, then covered that with sequins, let it dry, and spray painted that to seal it, and then printed it. You can see the sequins are starting to come off into the printing, but it did give the effect of fish scales pretty easily. This one is just a piece of lace glued into the mat board, let it dry, and then sprayed with spray paint so it would be sealed. And the student very carefully hand colored the rose and the petals in the lace pattern itself. This one is deceptively simple, but it works really, really well. This piece was made by cutting and pasting mat board. So there's a pretty tall height difference between the raised up section and the recessed area. But on the left, you can see all we did was ink it with black ink with a brayer, just ink sticking to the tallest part of the plate. On the right-hand side, you can see we took red ink, scraped and wiped the plate like it was a dry point or an engraving, and then rolled the black again over the top to the raised section so we could get both colors printing at once. This one is mostly low relief cut and pasted cardstock to make this face and head wrap. Same thing here. This one is almost entirely made of very thin pieces of cardstock cut and just slightly spaced apart to create that white area in between the pieces. If you do text, remember it will have to be reversed. This student made his piece entirely out of cut and pasted cardstock and mat board. This one is all cut and pasted cardstock. And you can see the variety of inking applications here. So it's the same plate printed over and over and over again, but with different effects almost every time. This one you just saw, our sea turtle. This one is just cut and pasted mat board, really, really simple, but it printed really beautifully. This one is cut and pasted cardstock primarily, with the cardstock spaced just a little bit apart to create those gaps in between these shapes. This one is mostly cardstock as well, and quite large. It's actually 24 inches tall. This one has a little bit of everything. The angels were made out of sandpaper, so they would have a different texture to them. There's lots of cut and pasted cardstock and mat board. There's even some glued in elements. These are some glued in pieces of wire, those spirals. This one I really like. It's very simple, but the design was simply cut and then spaced a little bit apart so that there would be gaps in between the little elements. And so in this case, we inked it by scraping and wiping, so the ink went down into the little gaps between the mat board or cut cardstock pieces. These have a variety of different inks applied to them, but most of these have some embossing and then some areas built up with cardstock to make these faces. Same thing here, there's a little bit embossing, but mostly these were cut and pasted circles cut out of cardstock to create this abstract pattern. This one is actually the size of an accordion. It's about this big in reality. And the vertical lines that make up the folding part, the squeeze part, were actually made with bamboo skewers like you would use for a grill. So almost anything you can think of that's not super thick could be used to glue into a collagraph, including things that are soft. This is one of my personal favorites. I really like the detail in this, but it's super simple in a lot of ways. It's just a well-preserved feather. So things that are soft, like plants, leaves, feathers, fabric, will not emboss at all because they're so soft, but they can be glued in and sprayed to preserve them, and then they will work as relief elements. So you could do things that are a little bit softer. Like these, you see some feathers in this one and some lace there as well. It's a nice contrast between the prettiness of the lace and the eeriness of the image of the skull. This was a leaf. It needs to be green, like fall crunchy leaves will fall apart. But if you can find one that's still got some sap in it, is still green, you can really create a variety of different effects. This one was inked and printed, you can see at least a dozen different ways. It was a very simple idea, but printed really well. This one is cut and peeled, like the very first one that I showed you, to just remove one layer of the mat board itself. This one is made almost entirely with glue. And so if you look at it, the areas where the glue is the outline of this weird fish, you see that there's ink on the top of the glue line, and then there's a white gap on either side because the paper can't quite get down on those two areas on either side of the line. This one has some cut and pasted paper and some glue work as well. This one has some cut and pasted elements, but the body was made with the glue method, so it creates the kind of ghostly outline around her figure. This one has some fabric glued into it, some glue, some stuff embossed to make this abstract face. This one has incised lines. It's kind of funny. It's a little rude, but it's kind of funny. The lines were incised by drawing them with a ballpoint pen. So really, she didn't have to do all that much to create this image other than physically make a drawing. You have to bear down kind of hard to really dent the mat board. And of course, if you're going to use text, you have to make sure everything is in reverse. This one also has incised lines to draw the girl's profile and some of the details in the background of her hair and head wrap. This is actually two different plates printed first. The birds were made by making incised lines into one piece of mat board, and then we inked it with a brayer so that the ink would stick to the raised up part, not the part that was drawn in. And then the skull was made as a relief, or cut and peel rather, on a second plate. They were both printed together to make this effect. This one has a ton of things happening in it. There's some cut and paste work. There are lines that are incised with a pen. We even poked holes all the way through the plate to create those white spaces for the stars, that effect in the background. This one turned out really well. It's got cut and pasted areas and also incised lines. You can really see the dark color of the ink sticking down into those incised areas. This one is super simple. We just took the metal pieces from binder clips and took them apart and then embossed them through the printing press dozens of times. We only had like 4 clips to work with, but we were able to emboss those shapes over and over again to create this pattern. Then we did a rainbow roll of relief ink on here to create that effect. This is probably my personal favorite of all of them in some respects because it looks really beautiful and it comes from total trash. Those shapes that look kind of like sand dollars or sort of like flowers in their own right are actually just the bottoms of 5 different drink containers, plastic bottles that would otherwise just wind up in a landfill if they didn't get recycled. So what we did was cut the bottoms off of some plastic bottles and emboss them through the printing press and then ink the plate in a couple different variations to create that effect. This one also has some embossing. This girl had a locket she wanted to use, so if you look closely at the dress, there's sort of a heart pattern. We created that by just embossing that part of the locket, just the heart part, over and over and over again to fill that shape. The pattern around the outside of the dress was made by using a plastic zipper. So we embossed that form to create that pattern as well. This one has some embossed shapes as well as some things glued into it. This is mostly embossed. You can see binder clips there again. This one has some embossed elements including wire and pull tabs from drink cans. We had a bunch of these. They've all been used up at this point, but you know those kids' toys that are not quite hard plastic but are kind of stiff rubberized material? That stuff actually embosses pretty well. And that's what these skeletons were made from. So if you can find something of that nature, you can use that. They tend to make pretty cool embossments. These worked really well. This was a kid's set of creepy crawly insects and other type toys that we embossed really well. This one is mostly embossed. It's meant to read as an abstract face. The nose is made from a long old-fashioned key, which actually sort of looks like the front of a nose and 2 nostrils on the side. Kind of works. This one has embossment and added in elements. The feathers printed really well here. This is mostly cut and pasted elements on top of embossment. Same thing here. Same thing here. This one was printed from like 3 different plates to create this overall effect, but you really can control what you're doing if you're careful about it. So you have a huge variety of options with this. You can go as crazy as you want to with colors. You can be as creative as you want to with your design. We have glue sticks. I've got hot glue guns. We have plenty of mat board right behind where Raven's sitting there on that shelf right underneath the etching area. We have some cardstock that you are welcome to cut and paste with, but anything that you make as far as your plates, I don't want to try printing them on the same day because we really do want to seal them. We want to paint them with spray paint. which we'll do outside. Normally we would do in the courtyard. Today, I guess we'll have to go out into the front of the building on the street that way. They will need to rest though, because if you were to try to print from them while the paint is not thoroughly dry, it'll just make your paper stick to the plate. Any major questions or freakouts or anything?
I have a question, but it's not like really a big deal. What is this project do?
You have some time with this. I adjusted our schedule a little bit, so you actually have a little bit of time. Let's go back and look at.
Because break starts next week, right?
Yeah.
I saw your email, like Monday, we don't have to come in.
Correct, yeah. So here's your schedule. So here's where we are now. We're on Collagraph. So we're looking for your artist proof by the Wednesday of the week we come back from break. So you definitely have time there. We're then going to move on to the monotypes, which is going to be a relief for you guys because you don't have to buy anything and you don't have to do any physical work in carving. You're simply manipulating the ink itself. So you'll create a variety of different images there. I've added in an extra working day for those, so I don't need those until the 9th. The last project was going to be your independent choice, making a print of your own choice, whether it's a silkscreen or a woodcut or whatever. I feel like we're running out of time, so to give you a little bit of a break, we're not going to include that. So you're in pretty good shape. I also put in here on your announcements that I adjusted the late work deadline on these as well. So even though we're looking at getting the collagraphs done by the 2nd, you're not going to lose any points as long as it's in there. Late work will be accepted with an 8-point deduction up until the 16th, which gives you 1 extra week beyond the normal 1 week extra. Does that make sense? You always have 1 week from the original due date, now you've got 2. So I don't think anybody's going to be in any kind of a time crunch on this at all. But you're absolutely right, Reagan. We are technically, you guys came in for me on the Friday of Labor Day week. Remember, we had Monday off. You guys came in on Friday. So you've technically already attended Monday's class. I will still be here. I'm going to still open the studio. So if you want to come in and work, you're absolutely welcome to, but it's not going to count against you if you don't. It's completely your call. Okay? Any other questions?